I'm now going to introduce the next keynote. You heard this morning from the CISO of GE talk about the extent to which within GE, identity has become absolutely core to her approach to security. And this is increasingly happening in enterprises around the world. We're finding that the conversation around identity security is finding its way into the boardrooms, into the C-suite, and it's becoming a more important topic. We're finding that CISOs increasingly not only own identity within their organizations, but they also are adopting a much more identity-centric stance to security. And so to continue that conversation, I'd like to welcome up Ron Miller. Ron is a journalist and has long been following this industry. He's a journalist for TechCrunch, and he's going to be hosting the panel of CISOs that we have with us today. So Ron, thank you.
Hey, good to see you, Brian. Thank you. Hey, everybody. So it doesn't look like he introduced you guys, so we'll go through the introduction quickly. Before we do that, I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for coming out this afternoon. This is my 4th year doing this conference under its various names, and we've done this CISO panel, we were saying, for the last 3 years. And you know, it's always interesting to get the perspective of these people in this job about the issues related to identity management. And this week in particular, and in the experiences that I've had personally in the last 6 months or so, I've come to learn that identity is not just a technical problem. It's personal when you have issues, and it's frustrating when you can't get into your applications or whatever it happens to be. So we're going to talk about some of those issues today with these folks. But because Brian did not introduce you guys, I'm going to just let you do a quick introduction, and then we can jump into the questions.
So I'm Kurt Lieber, CISO for Aetna.
I'm Kathy Orner, Chief Risk Officer for Carlson Wagonlit Travel, former CISO.
Awesome. I'm Robb Reck. I'm the CISO for Ping Identity. This is awesome. We get to be here with you guys.
So when we were backstage, we were chatting about identity. Imagine that. And you know, one of the things that these folks were talking about is that they're going through their large enterprises. They're going through what we call a digital transformation process, a massive change of systems and how they do business. And one of the things that's a big part of that is how you implement identity. So I wonder if you guys could just start off by talking about the role of identity in a digital transformation process. You want to start?
Sure. So we're actually going through a digital transformation right now, as are many companies, and identity is part and parcel of what we are trying to improve upon. We have recognized that the identity is the start of the consumer experience, and the better we can make that, the more likely they are to actually use the platform versus calling one of our call centers. So it's near and dear to us. We spend a lot of time and effort working on it. We're actually going through a number of things to make the login experience much improved, removing passwords, making it as streamlined as possible for consumers.
Hey, Kurt, can I just back up just a second? I know you guys have thought about it a lot. What is digital transformation for Aetna? And Kathy, I'd love to hear from your perspective as well. Do you have like a summary of what it means for your businesses?
So digital transformation for us is, our position is that healthcare needs to change. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. We view it as becoming a much more personalized, consumer-driven experience versus something that traditionally has gone through large employers. And so our digital transformation is taking the healthcare experience and making it much more consumer-friendly, so that if you think about shopping for a health plan, it hasn't always been the easiest process in the past. We want to make that much easier and much more friendly for consumers to do on their own versus having to go through their employers.
And digital transformation for us as a travel management company, primarily business to business, we see the industry ripe for disruption.
Yeah.
So we're looking for ways to digitize, to become omni-channel. So whether you're calling the call center, a traveler counselor, or you're using your phone or your iPad or your laptop, to make that transition. And we've gone so far to take our product teams and brought them together with technology. So I report to the Chief Technology Officer Global, but I have peers, 4 different CTOs, and the CIO is now my peer, and the CISO reports to me. And with that, I work very close with our digital CTO, And with identity, with millions of travelers coming in through our portal, it's critical that security and development are working hand in hand. There was a conversation, where does your external identity, does that sit in your product or in a different group outside of core security? So I think the identity is one of the disciplines within security that is really taking itself out of the back office IT. So part of that digital transformation forces us, and some of the skill sets are a little different, but it's really close to the business.
Yeah, so the way we think about it is really opening up the technology stack to make it easy to integrate, and really the end goal is meeting your customers where they are, right? Customer experience being the number one goal. Any industry that hasn't evolved to meet the way consumers want to consume information now is, like you said, ripe for disruption. I know that Rocket Mortgage has really disrupted the mortgage industry that was so paper heavy, so back and forth heavy. And I think every industry that hasn't figured out that digital experience for the customers is really ripe for disruption.
So you talked about what digital transformation is to your companies. Can you get a little bit more specific about how you've transformed identity as part of that process of becoming a more digital company, and what that means in terms of what we talk about here at Identiverse?
So for us, again, putting the consumer first. Historically, if you got Aetna health insurance, you likely came through one of your employers. And unfortunately, if you worked for one company and had Aetna health insurance with that company, changed companies and tried to get Aetna health insurance again, we would not know that you were the same person. That is an example of where we are changing that through our digital identity strategy,
that
so that we know.
Annoying, right?
It can be really annoying, and it's annoying for me personally as well. So we want to make sure that we put the consumer first, and regardless of what employer you're working for, or if it's private health insurance you purchase on your own, we're going to know who you are, and we're going to be able to track you through the life cycle of your health insurance experience.
How about for you?
Well, for us, we're taking we're taking the view that it's not just an airline ticket that we're booking. What's your experience? So we're putting that identity and trying to get more consumer focused, even though we're business to business, on your experience. So your digital, if you're booking airfare, or you're booking hotel, and you have different point systems, and you need rail, how do we put that all together for you? And one easy click on your mobile, for instance, where you can see your experience and have
do you
options.
see that linked to the person's identity, like knowing all that information is part of their identity?
Correct.
Yeah.
And now with GDPR, there's complicators and for some of the users, and so we need to make sure, of course, that we're in compliance with regulations, but also in compliance with expense contracts with the clients.
I think the easiest way to think of it is removing negative aspects to it, right? And you give a great one, Kurt, with the experience of using Aetna twice, but the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Any experience a consumer has that adds frustration. We were talking earlier about sentiment analysis in an IVR, where as you go through the phone tree, as you're getting more and more frustrated along the way, that by that time you talk to a person, you set up everyone for failure, right? And getting smarter. I think that's part of digital transformation as well, right? Seeing that from the first time they sign in, we have this context about the user all the way through the end that informs every decision along the way. The decision tree gets easier and smarter as we go.
Yeah, we have a complicator because the consumer, you can all book your own AR book and go really fast. And then you're forced to use a tool. From an identity standpoint, you want fast, you want speed, you want ease. You don't want necessarily the controls that are behind that, but that's what we have. So identity is right there, so critical to the user experience, to the business.
So Ron, you asked, from a technical perspective, I think single sign-on is an obvious issue, right? Anytime you have multiple systems from the same provider that you have to sign in multiple times, everyone's frustrated by that. That's one of the easy barriers we can move out of the way. And then the step up from that is when you sign back into your mortgage application, it goes, it now knows where you are and it prompts you for the right thing versus taking you to the beginning again. And really getting that context awareness, I think, is the real win for.
Yeah, I mean, I think that companies are still working on that. It's still a challenge for companies to do that kind of thing where they pick you up and they know, like if you started with a bank, for example, you start an application online, you get stuck, you go into the bank, they have a different system. They don't know where you were, and that's kind of identity frustration and system level frustration. So those are all challenges that I think are still existing for a lot of companies, and things that sounds like you guys are trying to work through. One of the things that we were talking about backstage was the password itself, and here it is. It's 2018. We're all still using passwords. I give you a quick story. I work for TechCrunch, but TechCrunch is owned by a large corporation, which is owned by a large corporation. So TechCrunch is owned by Oath, which was a combining of AOL and Yahoo, which in turn was bought by Verizon. So there's a huge layer of corporate stuff there. And every 3 or 4 weeks, I get signed out of my TechCrunch mail, and I have to sign back in and use a 20-character, password that I didn't use before, and I have to, first get a code on my phone, and then come up with a way to come up with this 20-character password, and then, get another confirmation on my phone through Duo that yes, it was me, and I approved the change. So you can create layers of friction in attempting to be secure. And how do you think about, like getting rid of that friction so that your internal users as well as your external consumers are getting a smooth and friendly experience that makes it easier and not harder to do business?
It used to be that those two were in conflict with one another, and maybe to some extent they still are, but we're starting to realize that they can actually complement each other. So at Aetna, we have this program called Next Generation Authentication, and that is designed to eliminate the password, and it does that by looking at your behaviors and the way that you hold your phone and the cadence at which you text and some of those sorts of things. And we find that that actually provides stronger security than a password because it can't be easily compromised, at least. A password, a phishing email will get you the password. We've all seen that. But it's much more difficult to replicate 52 aspects of how you hold your phone, hold and use your phone.
Definitely.
So that is an example where we can actually improve the security and also improve the user experience at the same time. We remove the friction, we give them a better experience, and then we come out of that having a much stronger security posture as well.
So Kurt, do you remove password, or do you just have the password up front and you're re-authenticating with these biometrics and behavioral aspects?
It depends on exactly how we register the user, but we are at a point where we can not have a password at all. So some of it's behavioral or biometric based, so if you have Touch ID on your phone, that's one example. Ultimately, we are going to completely eliminate the password. That is the goal.
That's awesome.
We're not quite there yet. Yeah. On the external side, we do try to federate with the companies, so you can single sign on through your own company and get to what you need to do. But we did just finish an effort from the internal, because we kind of forget about our internal clients, our employees. And what we've gone to for all our web-based applications is a tile footprint. So think of your phone you have all the different tiles and the apps, and you can click on it and you can get right in. It is some sort of, we have some workarounds in the back end so they don't see that, but to that end user, and when you have over 20,000 employees, many, in call center type or travel center environments, it really increases the productivity.
I'm sure.
And they're used to do that. You don't have to train them how to, click on the tile.
I think in the consumer side, there's a whole lot better adoption of, I'd say, password-less with a space in between. Not no passwords, right? Just less passwords. We've seen a lot more adoption about that. You see, Amazon, you can go buy something online without putting in a password because that's low risk when you want to go in and actually look at the transactions in the past and get into changing account settings. That's when they want to see a password, right? I think we're getting pretty good on the consumer side. I think at the employee side, there's still a pretty big barrier. We have a few customers who kind of make the passwords mostly invisible to their users. But for the most part, the challenge is that there's not a great standard way for us to get rid of passwords with something that has really high adoption rates. You might think your phone is a good replacement for it, but there's users out there who just don't have those smart devices still or aren't willing to use it or whatever the reason is. It's too expensive. Key cards, all the other replacements for it have other challenges with adoption and the inertia that we have with moving away from passwords. We haven't made it quite easy enough yet, quite standard enough yet to get rid of passwords in a workforce type of an environment.
So when I was talking to Alex, who's just preceded us on stage earlier this week, and one of the things that he talked about is like a lot of companies have a lot of logins. There's like hundreds or 100. Say there's 150, and there's dozens for sure. He said if you can get a system that gets rid of almost all of them, and you have some obscure mainframes or something that still requires 4 or 5, different logons, the number and percentage of people in your company that it's going to affect is going to be far less. Is that the kind of goal that you guys think about when you start thinking about, like reducing that kind of level of friction? Like, let's just get it so that in most use cases, we can get most people onto the system with the least amount of, friction, for lack of a better word.
We certainly do. So we don't try to cover every possible last corner case. There will be situations where people don't have smartphones, and that's okay. We're willing to accept there has to be other methods of authenticating them. You talked about what I would refer to as single sign-on and reducing the number of individual logons. That is, from a workforce standpoint, one of our cornerstone controls. We call it central authentication. It gives us a number of security benefits. So that's actually one of the ones that we push extremely heavily to the point where we will make vendor selections based on who will or won't integrate with our central authentication system.
We take that into an account as well whenever we purchase software, and on the development cycle, anything developed, they need to come into that. There's some legacy applications that you have to weigh the cost benefit analysis to how much is it going to take to rewrite this versus okay, there's one, and that's where that screen scrape stuff's coming in.
We like federation.
Yeah.
We do that. But I like the approach you're talking about, though, right? You're not going to try and do everything all at once. You find the biggest user group and understand what do they do most of the time.
Right.
And that's where you start, right? For us, it'd be our engineers and our salespeople, our biggest 2 departments, right? What are the main things that they do? Well, we're going to go after those first to make those as seamless and easy as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you think that you can get to a point where you can get everything under one system, or is there always going to be that stray legacy system that doesn't quite fit?
It's the long tail, right? You can for 80% of you can get 80% for about 20% of the cost, and that last 20% is going to be 80% of the cost. You really, to your point, you have to ask yourself, what is the cost benefit of investing? I'm sure you can spend an inordinate amount of money and get 100%. Is that really worth it?
Right.
I think for a company like Ping, we could get there, small enough, a more manageable number of apps. I would imagine for both of your enterprises that it's just not possible to get rid of those mainframe legacy systems that we can't single sign into ever, right? I assume that there's some things that you're just not going to be able to get after.
Everything's possible. It's just a question of how big of a check you have to write.
How much are you
And you're
willing to spend?
weighing, it's not the only security. So when you have a budget, where are you going to spend your money? Probably not on those one-off applications.
Not that last 2%, right?
No.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole notion of like when you need to really authenticate versus when you don't, right? Mm-hmm. So I was speaking to the Capital One people the other day, and I'm like, well, if somebody really wants to sign into my Capital One account and pay my bill, I'm all for it, So that's the point. If you're in the bill paying section, they can be pretty sure it's you because there's probably not anybody hacking your system to pay your bill. So like, how do you guys think about that? Like from your perspectives of when you need to like really ask for something to make sure this person is this person versus times when you can just sort of take a lower level risk score that this is going to be that person.
Well, I'll start off here. If you guys didn't have a chance to go to any of the Beyond Core Google stuff that was happening this week, or if you guys haven't looked at that yet, I think you should. It's a great way to look at this, where it's not only what applications are high risk and we want to have MFA on it, it's what functions within the application are high risk, right? So, in order for you to get access to my financial system, I'm going to want you to come from a corporate device, and I'm going to want to have 2-factor authentication. I'm going to have all this. But if it's a lower transaction, maybe you can only view things from within this system and not make changes. Well, I can have a little bit lower assurance of it, and you can get that granular level control with access proxies, and really getting that adaptive access is a key part of that. And risk assessing your way through the applications and then functions within those applications.
I would agree. Sarbanes-Oxley is a great example where historically we've all sort of recertified access on Sarbanes-Oxley. Any application that was in scope for SOX got recertification. A few years ago, we realized that we just had too many recerts that were going on, and so we started to look more granularly at, well, if it's a read-only access to that particular application, do we truly need to recertify that? And from a risk standpoint, the answer was no. So I do think you need to understand the risk of the application, the different types of entitlements you have within there, and have a much more nuanced understanding of what you're actually protecting, and then protect it based on the risk that it represents.
Our privileged access is, we treat that very different than general access
Right.
to our applications.
So, as you probably all have heard by now, Ping bought or announced that they had acquired Elastic Beam yesterday, and part of that is getting all this great AI team that Bernard brings with him when he becomes part of the Ping team. And when I was talking to Alex from Microsoft, he also mentioned how, and I think he did in his talk, that Microsoft uses data quite a bit to look for signals that something is amiss. So how do you guys see AI and machine learning influencing identity management moving forward? I mean, and obviously not just for Ping and Microsoft, but for the industry at large and your businesses in particular.
We're working closely. We have a peer of mine heads up our data scientist group, and they have a very robust data analytics program and products, and we are leveraging their data lake on the security side and doing some testing on behavioral analytics, and then looking at the different AI tools to see, where is the consumer coming from, and being travel, people naturally are ever different places than they typically are. But we're definitely keeping close to that, and I anticipate seeing more.
So UBA, is user behavior analytics and machine learning, are really the most important strategic security controls that we have. We're investing heavily in that. We've had a program underway for 3 years now. I've increased investment in that program every year since it's been there. For us, the ability to look across wide swaths of data, be able to look at all of the entitlements, all of the actions taken using those entitlements, and then understand what is anomalous, that is something that machines can do extremely well. And that's, in my opinion, the only hope we have of being able to detect the low and slow attacks where somebody compromises just a portion of your network and sort of sits there. You're never going to find that with humans looking at that. You're going to find that with machine learning and user behavior analytics.
Yeah.
And the key is not that humans, whether or not humans could do it, it's that there's just too much data, right? And right now we have, it's something like 0.1% of the data we collect gets looked at by humans. If you have that data being looked at by a really poor AI, you're starting to get some level of analysis on it, right? And as they catch up to humans and as they surpass humans, we start to have tools that can move us to levels of security that we just aren't aware of yet. And I think it's just getting that data and figuring out what does bad look like. Not just what does anomalous look like, because that's too much, that's going to be too many false positives. What does bad look like, and getting better at that over time.
Mm-hmm. So you obviously will get help from your vendors when it comes to some of this stuff. Ping will start building this stuff in, and it will become, if you're Ping customers, you're going to just get it as part of, and that's going to be true of just about every piece of software. I think artificial intelligence, machine learning is going to be table stakes. If it's not already, it's going to be pretty soon. But you guys are big enterprises, and you're probably doing some things on your own. You probably have data scientists. You said you did. So are you building your own tools? Are you looking at like the cloud vendors, like a Google or an AWS or a Microsoft, for help in this? How do you look at artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how you can implement that, whether it's part of identity or in a more generalized way?
Aetna has a philosophy of preferring to work with smaller startup vendors. That's something that not every company agrees with, but that has been our philosophy. And the reason for that is we find, number one, that startup companies are obviously much more nimble. They're much more receptive to customer feedback. And so where we have an emerging need that we foresee, like machine learning and some of the stuff that we're doing around that, and some of the next generation authentication stuff, we will look for smaller vendors that are sort of in the space. We'll work with them and help them develop a product that we feel will then help the rest of the market, as well as Aetna, obviously.
We've been looking at third parties, and we've engaged professional services and some to help us through some various, seems
A lot of questions.
really basic use cases just
Yeah.
to get started and our feet wet, and then we'll need someone internally. But on the security side, we're not going to have from a budgetary perspective, the luxury to have many scientists. So we're going to leverage our internal team that does this
And your
data
vendors,
science
right?
work. And vendors.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. We're partners with Bing. So.
I think to your point earlier, anyone who's selling based on AI, it's going to change over time. It's not going to be that this has AI or ML or deep learning or whatever. It's going to be, I do this function better than anyone else. And how you do it is going to be driven by AI or whatever you're using. But it's just about doing that function better. AI isn't a feature, right? It's a way of doing something. And to your point, as it's embedded,
technology, a base technology, right?
Yeah, you don't care what's under the hood, right? You care that we're delivering the best results around intelligence, and adding intelligence to everything over time is going to take the place of buzzwords at conferences.
Right. So we're zipping along here. We only have 6 minutes left. One of the things I did want to talk about was the idea that on Andre's keynote panel yesterday, he had one of the panelists who equated user experience and identity experience. He called the UX is the short form for user experience. He came up with the form IX. And I'm wondering, how you see identity experience and user experience linked overall to the internal and external experiences of your users. And, well, let's leave it at that, and we'll see if we have time for the follow-up.
Well, it's critical for us.
Yeah.
If we have a traveler and they're trying to book something and they don't have a good user experience, they want to go out of the network and just use their phone.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to be as fast, if
Right.
not faster. So that user experience, and sometimes there's conflicts, right? The digital officer and myself often get pulled in because there's conflicts between the security, the compliance team, not necessarily the identity, or the identity sets these are the standards, and then they want to make it more consumer orientated. And but that is, we're in business to be in business, and we have to have the user experience the best that it can be.
Yeah, security can't get in the way of doing what you do as a business, right? It has to
I
it has to
evangelize
protect
security as an enabler. With the security, you can go faster, right?
I think this gets interesting. That we had the keynote yesterday from the former CIO of Estonia. It gets interesting when we start talking about GDPR, privacy consent, the user owning their own data. That's where all of a sudden this intersection becomes a little challenging. Where I do want Aetna to know that this was me before and this is me now, but I only want them to know that if I said that they can know that, right? And it's giving me the ability to control it really changes the approach and the go-to-market. And it makes our jobs harder, but it makes the user experience so much better. And it's that digital transformation 2.0 where we allow the consumers to really direct how we give them that experience that I think is going to be the next wave for us to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as, when you look at all of the, data privacy, data control is top of mind, whether, no matter what level you look at it, people, entities want to protect data. What role do you see identity playing in that? Because it sounds like that's where you start to say, well, okay, I give you permission to do this and I don't give you permission to do that.
It's all about identity, right? It has to be tied back, and it's about when do you gather consent, how do you store consent, how do you share that between systems that are built without a consent awareness module, or how do you start to do that? And that's one of the big problems that we're seeing enterprises solve, and we're helping them solve, is getting that capture of consent and then figuring out how does this change our business practices? How does this change our ability to communicate within our own internal systems and also external vendors and other partners?
Mm-hmm. So it becomes almost like there has to be a trust mechanism between the company and the consumer. So there has to. So when I was talking to Capital One yesterday, they were talking about how they're selling services where you can use your Capital One credentials to sign on to certain high-level services. So, and I was hearing that, I'm like, I don't want to use my credit card credentials, So, there has to be, at some point you have to say, okay, this is okay to do this, and you trust the entity to protect, that they're not going to let any kind of bleed-in go on. It's just basically an easier way to get on.
You're
how
right,
do you do that?
That's an area where the trust has to be more than just the user's trust, and healthcare is a great example. There's a lot of people out there that don't understand security and have come to us saying, hey, I really want to be able to sign in to see my personal health records using my Facebook account. And I don't think any of you really want to use your Facebook credentials to access your personal medical records. So Aetna has to have a certain level of trust in whatever credentials are being presented as well, and that's where it becomes a little bit more of a conversation. And it's on us to educate the consumer on why they don't really want to use their Facebook credentials to see their medical records.
But conversely, if you did use a service, just using the Capital One thing as an example, then it would be up to you to also to say, this is a credentializing system that we trust, and we can get you to trust it too, right?
Sure, yeah.
I think GDPR was created because we can't trust enterprises to make privacy-centric choices for consumers. That's really what we're being driven to, a much more transparent trust but verify model, or verify and then trust maybe is a situation we're in right now. And I don't think there's a lot of trust for enterprises, and I think that's part of what we need to do is be more transparent, more upfront with how we're going to treat data, and give customers a clear expectation of what they should be getting and what we're doing with the information.
And we do that. It's a little complicated when we do it with the company, so the actual traveler or the individual's rights, the company is coming to us. So if that individual under GDPR wants a right to be forgotten or deletion, well, clearly we can't book travel if we don't have their data. And how far back, because if they want it and there's future reservations, so it's complicated.
Right. And if the more information you have, though, the more that you can understand the consumer, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So we have just a little bit of time left. So I just want to ask you about, we're talking about the identity experience idea. So you guys are in charge of making sure that identity gets implemented, or that your people are implementing identity in your case. So do you see a gap between, like you talked about getting together with the digital experience person, the user experience side of the house, and the security/identity side of the house, and getting those people to understand each other's needs, and how much of your job is doing that, and how do you get there? You got a few seconds to. I think we can
Or
go
3,
over.
2, 1.
I think they said we could go over a little bit. So go ahead.
We certainly haven't seen a huge disconnect there. I think we both understand what the other side is trying to accomplish, and that security has to be an enabler, and we have to support the needs of what the business does. Similarly, the business understands that if this is implemented poorly, there's a huge risk to the company and potential legal liability if we all of a sudden splash people's medical records out there.
Don't want to do that.
Yeah, so I think part of that comes from just being an insurance company. We have an inherent understanding of risk in our DNA. We haven't found that to be a particular bone of contention.
I mean, I will disagree just a little bit. That isn't one of the most important things that we do as security leaders, to spend time on those relationships and making sure that alignment stays there, because it's really easy for the alignment to drift apart if you're not really being proactive to get in front of those digital experience folks and the UX folks, and really anyone whose goals, annual goals, doesn't say security at the top of it. You have to have that relationship, or there is going to be drift and there's going to be conflict. My experience, it's a pretty big part of our jobs. Is that
no question.
Touch points?
No, we absolutely have to have the relationship. That I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just meant that that relationship has been sort of natural for us, and we haven't had a lot of contention and butting heads between the two groups.
It's a significant part of my job. The relationship, working with not just the CTOs and digital officers, but our head of commercial, our chief marketing officer, the marketing with the GDPR and the consents, you think of that. And it takes time for the relationship, but it's so predicated on trust. And with clients and those third parties, your consumers that are coming in, once you break that trust or lose that confidence and trust, it's much more difficult to get it back. And so to be as transparent as you can and really work closely and encourage the teams all the way down.
All right, we're going to leave it at that. Why don't you give these guys a hand, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.